This is the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. Here's your host, Corey Tusick.
Hey everyone, this is Corey Tusick. Welcome to the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. Thanks for tuning in. On today's episode, I interviewed John Vallis. John has a podcast, Bitcoin Rapid Fire. And if you're in the Bitcoin world, you'll see him on Twitter and everything. But, John and I had a good conversation. We kind of talked about, Bitcoin in its simplest form, but also what it means, in terms of freedom and, the freedom of money and how that can improve society and so forth. So I think you guys will enjoy it, and I really appreciate it. Without further ado, here is my interview with John Vallis. Well, welcome to the podcast. This is a new podcast, Bitcoin Made Simple. John Vallis is with me. A lot of you might know him from his podcast and on Twitter and, everything. I mean, he's all over. If you're getting into the Bitcoin world, you've probably seen John pop up all over the place. So, John, thanks for coming on. And, I started this podcast to kind of anticipate that there's going to be a lot of new people getting into the Bitcoin world. And so what I would ask you to explain Bitcoin to me like I'm 5. You don't have to quite go down to a 5-year-old's level, but, for a lot of the new people, I've been paying attention to it for a while. But how would you explain it to, in the most simplest terms, to people that maybe are just dipping their toe into this?
That's always such a hard question because there's so many different doorways into it. And I think people get lost in the mumbo jumbo. Like if you say it's an open, decentralized, censorship resistant, value exchange protocol that nobody controls, like people kind of go like, what? So, I call it freedom money. It's money. And you kind of have to go down the money rabbit hole. Like what is money? And I think money is the way you preserve the sacrifices that you've made in the past. And it's how you express your will in the world, at least as far as, you express your will in a market economy. And so to that extent, it's the preservation of your sacrifice and your ability to express your will without any intermediation. So it's true financial sovereignty. And I think it's important for people to understand the ways in which that is not the case with all other forms of money that they are forced to use today. That's a very interesting rabbit hole, and that's a very interesting history as well. But the punchline is right now, the cash in your bank, one, you can be cut off from it. Your bank can cut you off from it. The government can cut you off from it. It can be confiscated very easily. And two, every single day it's being devalued via the increase in the money supply. And in 2020, and of course, 2021, I don't think will be any different. That's become a much more obvious, apparent, and egregious infringement that more and more people are becoming aware of. And I think that's one of the reasons why so much interest is coming into Bitcoin, is because people are realizing when the government says they're going to stimulate, quote unquote, the economy with $3 trillion, what that means is that ultimately, that means that they're going to debase the value of, the existing holders of money in the society in order to redirect it. What they're doing, they can't create value out of thin air, but the money printer allows them to siphon off the value of all the other money in existence and reallocate it. So really what the money printer does is it gives the privilege of the allocation of resources in the economy, because that's done via money, to the government, to the central planners, rather than to the individuals who created and are presuming to store that value so that they can reallocate it at a later date for their own benefit. And so call it what you want. I call it theft because it's an involuntary confiscation of wealth. And I think more and more people are waking up to that. And again, so Bitcoin is freedom money. Bitcoin is money that people can't steal from you. They can't confiscate from you. They can't intermediate. They can't censor. It's yours to do with as you please. And, it can't be devalued or debased over the course of time. There's only ever going to be 21 million. So your share of the total can be calculated the first time you ever buy Bitcoin, and it will never, ever change as long as you hold on to that Bitcoin. And that's extremely unique. And a lot of people don't appreciate how unique that is, because we've never had something that was absolutely scarce. With a terminal inflation rate of 0, that's completely supply inelastic. So no matter how much demand there is, the supply won't change. We've never encountered anything like that. particularly in something as important and is in high demand as money. And so, those are some of the reasons why it's so exciting for people. But again, to answer the question, it's freedom money. It's money that's completely yours to do with as you please.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, freedom money, I think, is big. Freedom's always important. But, and I wish I would have got into Bitcoin a lot earlier. I've been paying attention to it,
So does everybody.
Yeah, I know. I think that'll be everybody's regret. It's like, no matter what point you get in, you wish you got into it earlier.
100%. And you got to come to grips with that, psychologically, so you can move forward. Everybody does. Yeah.
Because, I've been paying attention to it. I've said before, but, I wanted to buy 10 Bitcoin when they were $100 a piece, but I didn't fully understand it. I should have just taken the time to fully understand it, because I'm like, I can't put $1,000 into something until I fully understand it. And right now that'd be worth $480,000. So that would have been, a wise decision. Nice. So anyway, so everybody's going to have that. But whenever, like you mentioned with the money printing, when COVID hit last year, I'm like, and they started talking about how they're going to print money. I'm like, this isn't good. Like, that's not a good idea at all. So I started, exploring back to Bitcoin, like right when COVID hit. I'm like, okay, I got to put some money into that, protect against any inflation and printing that's going to happen. And then the halving, I actually had no idea that the halving existed. So I'm getting into Bitcoin, like dipping my toes in, putting some money in. And then the halving comes and it hits me. I'm like, oh my God, it restricts the supply chain. Like, I had no idea this was a thing. And so that is, I think, what pulled me down the rabbit hole, where I'm like, oh my God, this is a structured restriction on this new supply. It's as if Satoshi knew that this was all going to happen. Like, he timed it out perfectly. And so, yeah, I guess I walk people through like because I went through that crash course of, looking at everything, like what the restriction of new supply means versus the central bank just printing money. I mean, at this point, what's eye-opening to a lot of people is that 25% of the US dollars in circulation didn't exist prior to March 2020. And 75% of them didn't exist prior to the 2008 financial crisis. So, yeah, and I'm sure in Canada it's very similar and all across the world. So what should people be, most alarmed about their money losing value, just keeping it in the bank? Like I try to tell people now, don't put your savings in the bank, put it in Bitcoin. It might be volatile. So, how do you calm people's nerves?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot wrapped up there. And I think the amount as a percentage of money that was printed in 2021 as a portion of the total is actually more. I think it came in at more than 25, maybe it's 30 or something. But I think that stat lands a bit more impactfully if you say that more money was printed in the last, as you said, since the financial crisis, as was printed in the entire history of the dollar. If you're looking at it from a 75% perspective or whatever from the great financial crisis. And to your point about Satoshi's design, I mean, we tend to idolize Satoshi and rightly so. It's a beautiful, it's great to speculate kind of what his intentions, motivations, education was, what the reasoning behind a lot of this stuff. And as you said, the halving has come to be known as quantitative hardening versus the term we hear from central banks is quantitative easing. And one is a growth of the money supply. The other one is a restriction of it, effectively, at least this restriction of new supply. And, I would love to know someday what the specific reason, if there is one, for the schedule of, for example, the 4-year halvings. Why was that, chosen as a time frame? Was it to allow for a certain amount of adoption within each of those 4-year periods? And, I'd like to understand more about his philosophy in there and some of the other parameters of the network that were built into it. what was the last part of that question?
Just, like what with people, their money sitting in the bank is losing value. And I think, I've been properly put to the point where I haven't like really documented all, but I put the money in when COVID hit. And I put enough in to I had to feel the pain if it went down, I was like, I need to be able to get with this flow. And then I understood the halving and I started to learn about the quantitative easing that had been going on and all the money printing that has been happening since 2008. So I put more money in and more money. And now I'm to the point where I literally am I don't keep money in the bank because I think that that's a waste. And so I'm trying to, walk people through understanding, like my parents, they keep their money in their savings. And I'm like, it's lost so much buying power just by sitting there and earning, 0.5% interest. So, how would you articulate that to people? Of why? I'm not saying, people are like, don't put all your money in Bitcoin. I'm like, don't put all your money in the bank.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really is a shift in perspective. And it's a difficult one because if you're looking at Bitcoin purely through the same lens that you look at other equity or other investments that you might make, the kind of it's volatile, it's risky narrative works. But I think it fundamentally is not similar to any other investment. I think it's in a class of its own. And I think it's a paradigm shift. And as you say, I consider it as a savings account, right? So, and people think that would be insane, because it's so risky and it could crash and all this kind of stuff. But I just see it as a better way to preserve my capital than holding it in the bank or putting it in equities where there's counterparty risk and there's manipulation and there's several intermediaries that could influence things. Obviously, there's no hard cap supply on equities, that kind of stuff. So, I treat it very much the same way as you. And I think a lot of people that start to go down this rabbit hole do as well. They see it as, I call Bitcoin the most conservative in quote unquote investment you can make because it's money to me. Mm-hmm. And money is supposed to be the most conservative investment. Money is supposed to be the thing that you hold your wealth in. Yeah. Prior to going out further on the risk spectrum to get more yield. And I think we'll ultimately come to that point, whether it's in 10, 20, 30 years, whenever, hyper Bitcoinization happens, Bitcoin will become money. And let's say it roughly reflects the productivity growth of the earth on an annual basis, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever percent it is. And that value will accrue to the money that underlies that system, which is Bitcoin. And if you want greater yield, if you want greater returns, then you'll go out further on the risk spectrum and you'll go into equities and you'll deploy your capital in riskier ways. But money is supposed to be the most conservative store of wealth. And that's how I see Bitcoin. And when I say that to people, they're like shocked, right? Because they think it's among the riskiest things you can be involved in. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot wrapped up in this. One, like we said before, I mean, if you're comparing it to a money that has no limit, right? The US dollar, Canadian dollar, euro, they've all been tremendously abused since their inception, but especially over the last year. I mean, would you rather have a money that at the click of a button can be diluted by 20, 30, 40, 50% and has been that and has lost 99% of its value since its inception? Are you comfortable holding, a big chunk of your life savings in that? And not to mention the fact that, there's withdrawal limits from the bank and you can be shut off from it. And let's say you say the wrong thing politically and maybe MasterCard decides they don't want to be your customer. We've seen examples of this over the last few years. And so, do you not want an alternative that doesn't have those restrictions? And that, again, preserves the value of your prior sacrifice, the prior deployment of your time and energy, which is your work. Do you not want something that holds that value better in perpetuity into the future? And then on a macro scale, and this takes a little bit more digging economically to understand. But when you begin to realize the damaging effects that type of monetary intervention that currently goes on with central banking has on the economy and has on not only the cost of goods and services that you have access to, but the variety and quality of goods and services that you have access to, when you realize that the perversions and the distortions that messing with the price signal like that has on an economy, then you start to realize that it's not just about preserving the value of your savings moving forward into the future. But it's about kind of casting a vote for a fairer and ultimately more prosperous, more peaceful, market, globally speaking. And, it gets really exciting because once you understand that relationship, you understand how much productivity and how much efficiency gains are being siphoned off, are being withheld from people in the market because of this style of monetary system that we all live under, because so much gets to be skimmed off the top by the people that can create money at zero cost. And when you realize that those benefits of human ingenuity, innovation, productivity, efficiency should actually be accruing to all the participants in the market rather than a very, very select few, then it becomes kind of a political move. You say like this is fair money, fair and free money for the world, and everyone should have the same access to it and the same opportunity. And what that produces as a result is incredibly exciting. This is why there's a lot of talk of the concept of like a Bitcoin renaissance, not dissimilar from the renaissance we saw in the past, just amplified dramatically. And one thing that all Bitcoiners come off as a little kooky, right? Because we're kind of operating outside the mainstream narrative. But it's funny how, look, if any dynamic, and like find it anywhere, but if there's ever a dynamic where one person or one group of people are able to create something of value that the market values, but at zero cost, and everyone else in that market has to work to acquire that thing of value, the inevitable relationship is one of slavery, because one group is able to produce at zero cost what everyone else has to give away their time to get. And so that's what we have on a mass scale today with central banking. A small group of people get to create money at zero cost. At this point, it's literally just a click of a computer button. It's an entry in a database, in a spreadsheet. And everyone else has to give away their time, like on an increasing basis. So you've got to keep working longer and harder just to keep up. And that's another, I think one of the reasons why we see a lot of the problems in society today with mental health, with substance abuse, with all that kind of stuff, is because even though people don't consciously understand this relationship, obviously they feel it. They're being impacted by it, and they know that they're having to work harder and harder for less and less. And that's because one group of people can create money for zero cost, and everyone else has to work, give away their time for it. And as a result of that small group siphoning off all the productivity, prices are going up and up and up, but wealth is continually diverging, from let's say the majority to a small minority. And so again, like and people have drawn this conclusion in Bitcoin, Rob Breedlove, who wrote a great piece called Masters and Slaves of Money that I recommend to everybody, really illustrates this point, and illustrates it in some small examples where it's happened in the past and in Africa and other places. But, I say this to people, I say that that's what's going on. That's not hidden. I mean, you have the Fed chairs on national TV saying, yeah, we have access to infinite amount of money. And so we can deploy that how we like. And it doesn't sink into people that if you've got to work for your money, but another group of people doesn't, the only outcome is a relationship of slavery. And maybe it happens for a time slow enough that it's not sufficiently motivating for people to do something about it. But I think we're heading into a time where it's happening quick enough that people are starting to notice it, and it is becoming increasingly motivating to do something. And look, a lot of people saw this for the last 100 years, 50 years, 30 years. I mean, people have been decrying the central banking system for a long time. And the gold bugs were kind of the ones that were, beating that drum. But there was no really great alternatives. Gold is an interesting form of money, and it had some periods in the past where it, served the function of money fairly well, but it suffers from a lot of fatal drawbacks. And one of them is that because of its physicality and because of its high value to weight ratio, it centralizes. You know, it centralizes for the purpose of security. It centralizes for the purpose of usability so that, you know, you can, you know, store all the gold in one place, issue paper notes, and people can transact in that much more easily. And because of that, you introduce a massive amount of trust in the person, the institution who's administering that, who's securing that, who has control over that. And ultimately, that trust is broken. When enough money is on the table, when there's enough incentive to do so, trust will be broken. It may be preserved for a time, but if there's no true restraint on it, it will be broken. And this is what we saw in the Bretton Woods system in the US. And, you know, so after the war, all the countries got together and they said, you know, a lot of money printing went on during the war. You know, there's a lot of debt. We got to figure out a way out of this. Okay, how about everyone sent their gold to the US during the war anyways for safekeeping. All right, we've got all the gold. So let's have every currency. Let's make the US dollar the reserve currency, and all US dollars can be redeemed for gold. Won't that be a great system? And, you know, by and large, I wouldn't call it a great system, but it was certainly an improvement for, you know,
not a bad, 30, not terrible.
Yeah, exactly. For 30 odd years. But in 1971, Nixon just goes, hey, world, we're just going to not redeem US dollars for gold anymore. Hope that's okay. And what's the whole world going to do? I mean, the US is a superpower. They have all the gold. They have all the weapons. And so the world just goes, well, okay, I guess. I mean, what are we going to do about it? And since that time, we've had extreme debasement of all paper currencies around the world. And not only that, I mean, I'll direct your listeners to WTF happened in 1971. It's a great website that some great Bitcoiners put together, but it really is helpful in showing the relationship between the money that an economy, in this case, a global economy, must use, is predicated on, and some of the social effects that you might not intuitively draw a direct line to, how the money impacts those things, how the type of money impacts incarcerations, and of course, how the type of money impacts the cost of living and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But, you know, the punchline there is that it's fundamental to the proper functioning of an economy to have a sound money. And when you don't have it, a lot of problems emerge in society. And that's what we've actually seen since 1971. But the problem is that there's been no solution. So all the people that have identified this problem correctly, they've just been vying for a return to the gold standard. But that just puts us back in this cycle, this virtuous cycle where, sure, maybe there's some disaster. We get together for a time and we say, okay, we'll go back to gold. We're there for 30, 50, 100 years, whatever. And then it falls apart. So at best, it's a temporary solution. And Bitcoin came around and it's a sound money that people can't manipulate, that can't be corrupted. And because it exists in the digital world, you don't have that problem of centralization. Everyone can self-custody their own Bitcoin. Right. And everyone, because of the its divisibility and how it's transmitted over a communications network, you don't need to have someone else custody in order for you to spend it. You know, so it really is the best form of money that we've ever had by many orders of magnitude, in my opinion. And so as a result, now when people identify these problems, and as you said, in the last year, more and more people have now on the landscape of solutions, whereas 13 years ago, everyone just had to throw up their hands and say, there's nothing you can do about it, or you become a gold bug. Now on the landscape of solutions is, here's this sound money that will preserve the value of my capital, that I can easily acquire just with my cell phone, that I can custody myself, that I can take with me anywhere I go. So if I need to pick up sticks and leave because my government is too oppressive, or, some sort of emergency or whatever, I can pick up sticks and go. It's acceptable and exchangeable all over the world. Like that is I won't say perfect, but far closer to perfect money than we've ever had. And, so I think more and more people are recognizing that. And because it's so easy, and because there's so much great content about it, and because the macro landscape around people is forcing them to start to ask these questions, more and more people are funneling into it. And I don't see that changing. I see that accelerating. And, that is the path, in my opinion, to hyper-Bitcoinization, where everybody, both via necessity and out of their own interest, goes into this better form of money, and that forms the basis for another renaissance. And because as we were saying, if society, to put it a little bit too broad strokes, but if we say that society has been degrading since 1971 as the world has been on a paper money fiat standard, and worse as time has gone on, then once the world is on a sound money standard of the nature of Bitcoin, then we start going in the opposite direction. The world starts getting better and better and better and better. And that's what excites me. And that's what excites so many people in this space to talk about it and to promote and to educate, is because what kind of a world can be built on top of a money like this is really exciting, and it kind of staggers the imagination. And there's no utopia. That's not the track that I'm going down here. There's always going to be inequality based on talents and work ethic and all that kind of stuff. But at least the rules of the game will be the same for everybody. Nobody is going to be able to cheat it. People will start at different places along it, and that will have an effect. Like, everyone's still going to be different, but nobody can cheat the system, and we'll be incrementally going in a better direction rather than a worse. And I think that's what's so exciting. And just a final point about that is, a lot of people might push back, and like, you have the Steven Pinkers of the world saying, like, the world has never been better, life has never been better. And I think you could probably challenge that on a few domains. I mean, if you look around the world today, especially the developed world, there's a lot of mental health issues. And, whether this is economic, this is media, this is, there's a lot wrapped up in it. But the fact is, like, there's a lot of unhappiness in the world. And yes, like, we have mobile phones and we have Netflix and we have Instagram, and we're supposed to assume that that's some sort of pinnacle of technological development and human happiness. And I just don't agree with that. I think, as I said earlier, a lot of this technology advancement is great. And, I love innovation and stuff like that. But one, what would we have had if we were on a sound money standard already? That's an interesting question to ask. But two, how much has been held back because of the nature of the money, which allows, a small group to siphon off so much of the efficiency and productivity gains that the world and the market actually conjures up. So I think, since 71, things have been unwinding. And I think now we finally have a really great foundation to start to build something better on. And that, ultimately that's why we're all here. Of course, we have self-interest in this, but that's a great thing about Bitcoin, is that it's kind of a meta incentive that aligns everyone's incentives. And the primary reason it does that is because the rules are the same for everybody. And so I think, like, I'm involved in this space. I invest in, I store some of my capital in Bitcoin because I think it's going to benefit me. But I also do that because the same thing that benefits me is what benefits, the network and all the other people that are aligned with it. And that's a very powerful notion. So I think that's some of the reasons why there's so much excitement around this.
Yeah. And I've seen that, even with, like, as I've gotten into it, and then, I have friends asking about it, and starting to get into it. And it's like, I see that because it's of benefit for both of us, because it's a fairer system for them to get into. And it's also beneficial for me because then the network grows. More people are using it, more people are adopting, and the price goes up. And, the awareness now, I think, like, the genie is out of the bottle, like the toothpaste is out of the tube. And I don't know if it's going to really, because, in 2017, everybody's like, wow, can you believe that? It's like $15,000 for a Bitcoin. And then, it kind of disappeared out of the mainstream news. But, I don't see that changing now. At least not as much in the past.
I don't either.
What was it like, over the last couple of years? Because let's say, since I've been into it, there've been like a couple times where I put money in and it maybe dropped 20% or something. I'm like, oh, but I've been in a very fortunate, and I think a lot of the class of 2020 has been in a, mainly number go up scenario, where it's like, oh, put money in there and, oh my God, there's more.
If you got in March of 2020, it's been a great ride.
Yeah. There've been a couple times where, like, I like doubled down and then tripled down and there was a little bit of a dip, like, and I was like, of course, right whenever I go big, even bigger, like there's a dip, and then it recovered quickly, and now we're at all-time highs again. 48,000. I'm sure we'll hit 50 soon. But what was it like, going through that like 80% drop? Were you were through that, I assume, right? You were back a part of that. I mean, because it hit 19,000 and dropped down to 3.
Yeah, I think in December 18, it was at like 32 or 3,400, something like that. Honestly, not one of them have ever phased me. I mean, look, like to the extent that you buy something at 15 and it drops to 3, and you think like, well, that investment could have gotten me, 3-4 times as much. That stings, because you could have had more Bitcoin, but you can't time these things, and like you never know what it's going to do. And sometimes you're on the winning side of that, sometimes you're on the losing side of that, which is why I think, over the last 2 years, this approach of dollar cost averaging has really come to the forefront for 2 reasons. One, because you get into this and there's so much noise and there's altcoins and there's trading, and people are like, oh, I can trade the volatility. I'll just buy it when it's like low, and then when it's up there and it goes up a lot, I'm going to sell it and wait for it to come back down. It's like, yeah, that sounds like a great plan. Good luck with that. but it just to save you the psychological turmoil of always being like trading or watching it or wondering when to get in and get out. Like now the DCA approach that I think it averages your cost over time, of course, but it also allows you to release the psychological, from the psychological prison of being involved in this thing. And then you can focus on educating yourself or expressing yourself or learning more about it. And you're not so crazy focused on the price, because a lot of people fall down that, are subject to that when they come in. And I don't think that's ultimately beneficial. But, to answer your question directly, the price drops, like there's never been a price drop where I've been like, shit. I've always been like, amazing. Like I hate this price action that we have now. I hate it because I feel like this thing is inevitable. Hyper Bitcoinization I'm extremely confident and convicted that that's going to happen. And I want more time to stake more territory. And when I see the price go from 10 grand to, let's say, 50 grand, that makes me sad, because it makes me realize that the window of opportunity is closing. And I don't really care what that means for my fiat currency exchange value of whatever my holdings are. I want my nominal number of Bitcoin to increase. And every time the price goes up, that means it's harder for me to make my nominal amount of Bitcoin increase. So, I hate price action. I wish we'd be in I wish we'd have another like 5-year bear market tomorrow. There'd be a lot of building. There'd be a lot of great education. But I just, like you said, I think the genie's out of the bottle. The last 2 years, especially like 19 and 20, the amount of content in the space has just exploded. Like even in 17, there was like a couple of podcasts, a couple of articles, a book or two, and before that, it was basically Andreas doing most of this, the YouTube stuff and writing. And now like there's a new Bitcoin book out every week. There's articles all the damn time. Just check out Guy Swan's Bitcoin Audible, and he has to do 1 or 2 a day just to keep up. Everyone's talking about it. There's a bajillion podcasts. So obviously it's out of the bottle. And the thing is with Bitcoin is the only way, in my opinion, that you can dismiss it is if you dismiss it from the get-go. If you're like, it's not possible to have a non-state money, or it's not possible to have digital scarce money or digital sound money. So a lot of the gold bugs dismiss it for that reason. And a lot of the, like, let's say mainstream economists, mainstream finance types dismiss it for that reason. But if you actually say, I'm a skeptic, but of course it's possible. So the best way to test my skepticism is to actually learn. If you take that approach, there's no way you come out the other end thinking this thing is a scam or a pile of shit, or it's not going to work. There's been too many really smart people that came before you that asked those questions, that put the pressure on their own thinking and put the pressure on this thing, went into every nook and cranny and explored it and explained it and tried to poke holes in it. and they come out the other end saying, holy shit, this thing is very, very unique. And so that's the genie out of the bottle. And as this explosion of content grows, more and more people are going to be hooked in by that. And a fascinating thing that I like to dig into on my podcast is there's a genuine culture emerging around this thing. And I guess to frame it up like what I was saying before about a renaissance, you would expect that, right? You would expect these new forms of interaction behavior, this new sound money system to conjure up a unique culture. And the first manifestation of that I've seen, and like, I haven't come across many people that get, into this and start learning about it that don't report this, but it's one that a lot of mainstream people would be probably surprised to hear, is just the extent that it actually changes individuals. Like in pretty fundamental ways, like people really start changing their behaviors and their perspectives on things. So, you're who you are and you're a normal person. Then you fall down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and your philosophies begin to change, your perspectives begin to change, the way you see the world, in various domains changes. And then the way you see yourself in the world changes. And then the behaviors that you engage in changes. And a lot of people report, taking better care of their health and, getting rid of negative relationships, focusing on positive ones, spending more time educating themselves, saving a lot more, thinking more about the future, having a greater hope for the future, thinking about having families. Like, this is very, very common stuff. And for people to hear that there's such dramatic behavior change associated with a quote unquote money on the internet is a really bizarre notion. But again, it seems to be almost unavoidable when you get involved in this stuff. And I love, trying to understand that process better.
Yeah. I mean, even, we have a couple of kids and, want to have more. And as our family gets bigger, we're like, yeah, we need more land. We need, we need a bigger house, all that kind of stuff. So we always wanted to like kind of get out of the suburbs and into more like, we said like a half acre to an acre of land. But now I'm like,
very common.
Yeah. But now I'm looking at it.
Get out of the city.
I'm like, ooh, there's like a 25 acre plot of land. And like, I'm telling my wife, like, she's like, oh, we only need like, I've got her up to like 4 now. She's like, oh, we could go for 4, but I'm like, there's 25 acres. This has like, a lot of woods. It has a stream. Like we could have like hydro power, electric and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh my God, like you look back at where I was just before I put money in Bitcoin. And I'm like, I wasn't even thinking about this stuff. I even, have thought about getting healthier, even mental health. I feel like has been one of the big focuses, of like, I got rid of social media across the board. Like now starting a podcast, it's like, I guess I will have, my Twitter account for the podcast and, a way to communicate digitally. But as far as personally goes, I was finding like how, I wasn't like depressed, but it would put you in a bad mood. You'd go on Facebook and like, you feel these terrible things like envy and jealousy of other people. And I was like, that's not how I want to live my life, and now it's to the point where, you see like work was always so important and working. And now you see the value of like, putting money in something that can help sustain you, where you maybe have to work less as time goes on, you have more freedom. A year ago, I wouldn't have had time to spend half a day a week putting together a Bitcoin podcast. And now here I am. I'm like, oh yeah, I could afford to, spend a handful of hours doing it. So yeah, I see that.
Like every true belief, it restructures your hierarchy of value. And that seems to be what's happening across the board in Bitcoin. It's just, people's hierarchies of value of how to spend their time and who with and what for is being restructured. And I think restructured in a way that's very beneficial to them. And you mentioned kind of citadel, right? Like having your own place away from people that's independent. I mean, once you achieve sovereignty over the most concentrated form of value that we collectively as a society have, which is money. Once you've established complete sovereignty over that, you look around your world for other forms of sovereignty, and you want to establish it in other places. So your living environment, like where are the dependencies that make me non-sovereign, that make me subject to the will of other people? Where are those in my life? And like anyone who lives in a city, it's like, well, your electricity, your water, your apartment building, your transportation, like we're very much beholden and dependent on the systems of other people, the will of other people. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but it is a dependency. And if one of your goals is kind of like complete sovereignty, and I think that's an absolutely fine goal and one that I have myself, then you want to the extent possible, reduce those dependencies, or at least find like a happy medium that you're comfortable with, And so for me, I, very much aspire to that place on a lot of land that's entirely independent, off the grid, that kind of thing, where there's, you don't really have any dependencies. And then as and when you wish, when you want that dynamism, that complexity, that novelty of experience, you can go into, centers that have far more diversity and things on offer, but you can retreat back to a place that you're completely sovereign over, that you're a master of your domain, as it were. Mm-hmm. And I think the idea of sovereignty and of freedom has been so lost for so long by most people in the world because of our systems of money, systems of governance. This has been the story of history, basically, is, since the time of the agricultural revolution, things have concentrated, and that concentration has meant more novelty and more specialization and more diversity in our experience of everyday life. But it's also meant more dependency. And anytime you have a dependency, that is a dilution of your freedom, of your sovereignty. And so now I think this idea, because largely of the impetus Bitcoin is causing, people are starting to think about that notion more. Mm-hmm. And they're starting to think, how important is it to me? How much more of that do I want to establish in my life, and where? And that's a process of, reorienting your plans for your life and being like, you know what, I wanted that penthouse, like a place in Miami because it's fly and by the club and all my favorite restaurants. But actually, I'd rather have that place in the woods that I'm completely independent, where I'm completely independent, raise a family there, and travel around and check out like cool city centers, whenever we want to, or whatever mix works for people. But I think the idea or the impetus for thinking about your life through the lens of sovereignty and freedom is something that Bitcoin is generating more of in people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I something I've been like contemplating is, I said it's unfortunate that there isn't a completely free, like new land, like there isn't in America where it's like, hey, there's pure freedom to this in this new country, right. Come here. Because I certainly would flock to that. And I think a lot of people would. But then I did just see somebody posted about, I think it's maybe Thailand has like 50 uninhabited like Caribbean islands or not Thailand, tropical islands, something like that. And I was like, ooh, there it is. There's the new country. Like, let's all move to that one.
That's the hunt right now, right? Like, especially in light of all this COVID nonsense that people, a lot of Bitcoiners are wondering, like, where is the most freedom in the world right now? And I, in the past, like in our lifetimes, it was places like Hong Kong and, Gibraltar and Malta and the Cayman Islands, where basically it's like, where has the lowest tax? And that's like kind of a proxy for the most freedom. But now it's seeming like, red state US are the ones most intent on preserving individual rights and freedom and low taxation, that kind of stuff. And it's still very early days for the sovereign individual thesis. That's a great book, for people listening if they haven't checked out. It kind of explains how and why history has unfolded how it has, and what the impacts of the cyber economy and information technology is going to have on the structure of governance and how people are going to respond to that. But I see that playing out. Mayor of Miami yesterday was saying, we're going to allow our employees to be paid in Bitcoin. We're going to allow people to pay taxes in Bitcoin, and we're going to put Bitcoin on the the treasury. We're going to put it on our balance sheet. And, so that's the beginning. That's the beginning of this competition between jurisdictions to say, hey, now Bitcoin's going to be a big thing. People with Bitcoin are going to be well capitalized, and innovative and building something new. We want a piece of that. We're going to try to attract them. And jurisdictions all over the world are going to now be in a competition for that. And it's going to drive services up and prices down in those jurisdictions. And by prices, I mean like taxation and the costs associated. And, maybe I don't think there's a clear winner yet, unfortunately, because I'd love to just be like, boom, let's go. Let's all
go there. Everybody meet.
Yeah. But I think that'll play out over the next 10, 20 years. And, maybe we'll have to move around a bit to find, that the final, place where you want to really sink in roots. But it's definitely underway, and that's encouraging.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is weird. Whenever you think that way, and it's like, I have this, it's part of the political situation in the world right now that I hate, that everything's like, it's extremism, and you're in one camp or the other for everything, and people identify as one thing, but I'm like, oh yeah, I would want to move to red states so that I could have that freedom. And then if you say that to somebody, they like automatically come up with this laundry list of things that you believe in, apparently. They're like, well, you must think this, and this, and this. And I'm like, no. And like, my biggest thing is like, I just don't want people, like, I don't care what anyone else does, but why do you have to?
I just want to be left alone.
Yeah. I just want to do my thing, and it's like, if you don't like what I'm doing, then don't watch me. Don't look at me. Don't like, why does it bother you so much that I'm doing what I want to do? And I have this theory that like, it's this absolute need that people have for like verification to feel like, they need a justification in what they're doing, because they're deep down not really happy, or like they haven't really found that. So they're like, I need you to be, happy. Like, I need you to approve of what I'm doing in order to like feel like I'm doing something right. Whereas I think a lot of people that, are more in the sovereign individual mindset are like, I can judge for myself whether or not I'm happy. And I could care less what you think about how I live my life. But it is unfortunate now in this world where you're like, if you say that, they're like, oh, you must love Donald Trump and you must be a racist and you must blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, like it means none of those things.
You're totally right. And, I think there's a lot wrapped up in it, but I do think one of the fundamental reasons is that when people step out of like the norm of whatever political ideology or type of behavior, like it is inherently a threat to those people that are still in that domain. Mm-hmm. And, I've just started reading this book, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit that I haven't read it earlier in my life, because I have always enjoyed reading. But I'm reading the Gulag Archipelago right now. And it's one of the things that concerns me a lot is with all the way that the political domain and rhetoric is happening in the world today. It seems like people don't have any appreciation for how things went really, really, really wrong in the past. Mm-hmm. Like they kind of think like the evils or the tragedies of the past were like, how could people not have noticed that this evil had emerged, and why didn't they just stop it like when it happened? Like we're so much smarter now than they were. And that's just not the case. Those things happened in the past because first it was a drip, and then it was a drip, and then it was a drip. And most people acquiesce to the drip, and they move in herds, and they think in herd mentality, and they just accept. And then you sprinkle in fear of stepping outside of the mainstream narrative, fear. And before you know it, you're in a place that's really, really dark where anything can happen. And bad stuff does happen. And by that time, you're too powerless. You're too afraid to do anything about it, to stop it. And then you actually contribute to the atrocity through your complacency, if not through your direct involvement, right? Because all those people that worked for the Soviet government the German government, pick your poison anytime these atrocities have happened. It's not like all those people were bad, evil people. Not at all. They were just, they were just slowly strung along, slowly acquiesced, slowly didn't speak up, until the point where they actually believed they were in the right in a lot of those times. And that like what they were doing wasn't evil. What they were doing was good. It just required this, this business to get to execute on that good. And there's so little appreciation for that today. And the COVID stuff is such a great example of that, everyone around the world, just without any work on their own behalf, without any investigation, without any pushback whatsoever, just agrees and acquiesces with what has been passed down from pick your authority source, World Health Organization, government, whatever. Similar and undergirding all that is what we were talking about, the money previously. That is another system of extreme oppression, of extreme acquiescence to something that's unjust. And so you pile all these things on top of each other, and then you have a political divide and ideologies that are incredibly combative, towards one another. And it really sees the other as a form of like evil enemy. And we seem to be in a landscape or a time in society today where, truth and rational and logical thought and discourse doesn't seem to be at all a priority. It's all about emotion, fear, and acting in accord with your side of things, regardless of the truth, regardless of whatever data is available, regardless of logic. And when we find ourselves in a place like that, really, really unbelievable things can happen, because that's the story of history. You never allow yourself to believe that unbelievable things can happen, and then unbelievable things happen. And it's only in hindsight where you go, wow, I can't believe that happened. Right? Like that's what history is. Like, pick your period. There's so many examples of that. And I don't know why we continue to be so blind to that. I mean, obviously education and having a historical context is part of appreciating that. But, so I'm extremely excited and motivated about what Bitcoin represents for turning that around over the long term. But we're in such a precarious situation in the world today, far more than I think people realize, that, we're in those periods where people have acquiesced for so long and done away with truth and logic and rational thinking for so long that I think, we're in a place where a spark can set off an inferno right now. And what that is, I don't know, because you can never really predict that, but it's just really concerning to me that nobody seems to care about truth anymore. And, once you let go of that, all bets are off. And that's why I feel personally like right now I'm living in some kind of bizarro world. And that's a disconcerting feeling, because it means less things are predictable, right? Like if you feel like the world is, the more you feel like the world is predicated on truth and logic and reason, the more as an individual you can feel confident that you can get a hold on the world. You can kind of predict and expect certain things to happen. And we're in a period now where that has been diminished greatly. And that's disconcerting, because then it kind of makes it more difficult to move through the world, because you have far less confidence in what's going to happen.
Yeah. And I feel like politically homeless, where it's like, because you're just like, what's going to happen here in the future? And having that uncertainty is not easy for people. And I think that the media, I mean, my real thoughts, I think the general news media and all that are like the scum of the earth.
100%.
Because I'm, for people that don't know, I'm in the movie and entertainment world and do producing and distribution and everything. So I'm very familiar with that. I went to school for this stuff. And I remember, I was in college in 2008, and I'm sitting there looking at the landscape thinking, like, this cable, I actually just said to my wife recently, and she admitted. She hates to admit that I'm right, but I was like, I predicted all this of how it would break down. Like the basic cable package would no longer exist, but then it would build back up into all these different things where you basically might as well have cable again because you have to subscribe to 20 different services. But along the way, I was like, this is going to destroy the news media. And that is such a cash cow for the elites that I'm really, really curious. Like, I didn't want the chaos that would come from that. But I remember for a long time thinking, it's going to be interesting to see how they flail on their way down the pit. Like, because they're the news media, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, all of them will be dead. They're already pretty much dead. And they're bleeding out right now. And I just thought, what's it going to be like? But I never predicted that it would be this insane. Where right now they are doing everything they can. They've always been blood money, but now they're doing everything they can to pit Americans against each other and people against each other, and just in general conversation, it kind of hit me yesterday talking to a friend and I'm like, okay, if you're more on the left, you think that we're in this pandemic because people on the right didn't follow protocols, like the media has successfully vilified half the country. And then conversely, if you're on the right and you're, not a free thinker and you're just going down, you think that everyone on the left never wants you out of your house again, when really everybody wants life to go back to normal. But the media has trained you to think one way or the other. And it's like, and I just was really like, that bothered me yesterday to sit there and think about, like, wow, there are a lot of people out there that think the only reason we're in this. Personally, I think the virus is real, but I don't think there was anything you were going to do to stop it. Like, I think that where we are right now was going to happen regardless. And the kind of is proven by the fact that some places have taken major restrictions, some have not. And it's really kind of just run its course. And it is what it is, like the difficult conversation to have with people is that, I mean, you can get into the numbers of how few people it is, but it's like, yeah, it's a virus. Somebody's going to die from it. It is what it is. You should move on with your life,
Yeah.
Like people are going to die in car crashes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's disconcerting to a lot of free thinkers, Bitcoiners, whatever, is how much it illustrates the failures of centralized planning and centralized authority, whereby, we found ourselves in this place where the people that govern you can tell you, your family, that they can't earn a living. Let's say you're a sole proprietor in a business, whatever, that they can just shut you down and you can't earn a living. And you can't make a choice you nor your customers can make a choice about their own safety, but someone else is making it for them. Mm-hmm. And we've gone so far down the road of the state being so large and being so invasive in people's lives. And the crazy thing is, I mean, it's like a Stockholm syndrome sort of, scenario, or, Plato's cave, or pick your metaphor. But, people don't really realize that the way that it is and how far it's gone and how big it is, and that it can be any other way. The tricky thing about the present moment in any era, that you kind of think that because all time and development has come before it, like this is like the vanguard of it is the vanguard of history, and therefore it's like the best things should or could be. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes it more difficult to, like, it's like the fish in water sort of thing. It's like, the two fish are swimming along and like one of them says, like, isn't the water great this morning, Bob? And Bob smiles and nods, and then the other fish goes on, and then Bob asks his friend, like, what's water? It's like people just don't realize the true circumstances of the surroundings of the structures that they're embedded in, because they were born into them by and large, and that they seem extremely normal. So they're not being assessed on their merits. like they're not being isolated and assessed on their merits. But I think, this current quote unquote crisis, for a lot of people, it's started to get them to ask those questions like, is this the best we can do in terms of a form of governance? Is this the proper level of control and authority over our lives that our government systems of government should have over us? And a lot of people are saying, fuck no. But then again, a lot of people, like to my point earlier about acquiescence and just following the herd, a lot of people are just acting out of emotion and, kind of a typical adherence to the status quo, and just saying, yes, like whatever they tell us to do, we do. That's what you do. So if they say shut down, if they say wear a mask, if they say, bend over and lick your own asshole, that's what we have to do. And
thank them for it later.
Yeah, exactly. And irrespective of the cost, irrespective of the downstream effects. I mean, in this country, the government has borrowed, I think, has accumulated more debt than every other government in the history of the country combined. I think 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 times the last year's debt, which was among a record year as well. And by last year, I mean 19. Money supply expanded tremendously, but because nearly as a percentage, nobody understands what these things mean in the broader population, that what permits the acquiescence. That's what permits just saying yes. Oh, if to save one life, I don't want to kill Granny. So sure, I'll put the mask on and I'll do all this kind of stuff. And that's what I'm talking about. That people don't realize how dangerous that is. People don't realize that that's what leads to the degradation of society ultimately, and the co-option by people with more nefarious intents, and then the combative, the propensity for different ideologies to spring up into combat and to have really, really, really gnarly things end up happening in a society. And we're so hubristic. We think, any population that hasn't happened to, or at least hasn't happened to in a few generations, always just think, not us.
Yeah, it's not going to happen to us.
Like you think the Germans thought like, oh, we're totally doing concentration camps and genocide in the next decade or two. 100%. That's just who we are. Fuck no. They were, developed, rich, big middle class, lovely people, just like the rest of, people in Europe at the time or anywhere else in the world right now. They're just people who went about their business, grew their families, like tried to enjoy life. But these things that you can't easily identify unfold over time. And if you're not careful about them, they unfold in really, really tragic ways. And I think that's part of the reason why it's so important to have certain absolutes in society where you do not tread, you do not, you never change, because they're meant to be those kind of North Stars that at least attempt to prevent those really bad things from happening. So freedom of speech is one, right? You never, ever, ever trample on that, because if you let go of that, if you make it so people can't express their ideas, so there can be so that the level and quality of discourse can't be what it needs to be to really vet ideas and ideologies. If you lose that, that's another step toward that really tragic outcome. And look where we are today. People are telling you things you can't say. People are being censored. Oh, you can't say this. You can't say that. You're canceled for this. You're canceled for that. We're there. Yeah. And that's super, super dangerous. And once you lose those pillars, again, all bets are off. And, I get goosebumps just articulating that, because as hopeful and optimistic as I am ultimately for, a new world predicated on Bitcoin, I'm really apprehensive about what happens in the interim period, because I appreciate how things have happened in the past, and I see a lot of parallels today. And you could make a real easy argument. The level of rhetoric and the emotion today is even more absurd than it was in many instances in the past, where really bad things ended up happening. And there's so little appreciation for the importance of those things. And I just hope we wise up before
it's too late.
It's too late.
Yeah. I see that, I see that Bitcoin is the potential to save us from that. And, the internet as a whole, because I don't think they really expected. I don't think governments expected us to be able to ever communicate this way and so freely. But yeah, the freedom of speech. I mean, that's terrifying. That I always say I've never liked a politician ever. There's not one politician where I could say, yeah, I like that one. But what really, like, the only thing that made me really sick over the election cycle in America was when Twitter banned Trump, and then that one app, Parler, got like attacked and removed. Because people said, "Oh, well, Twitter will ban him. They're a free company; they can do that." But he's on Parler, so he can go to Parler and he'll be on there. People can still hear him. And then Google and Apple said, "Oh, we're not going to have Parler on our app store anymore." So all of a sudden it's gone. They're like, well, you can go to the website. They have a website. You don't have to have an app. And then Amazon Web Services said, we're not going to host the site anymore on our servers. So like within a day, it was just silenced. And like that, I mean, literally it was like, I felt like I saw a ghost. And that was the scariest thing that I think has happened. And again, I don't really even like Trump, but like, I was just like, oh my God, this shouldn't happen.
But this
shouldn't happen across the point. Yeah.
These pillars of society should be afforded to everyone, your friends and enemies alike, because that's the point of them, is to kind of keep everything in as great a, peace and sense of cooperation and coordination as possible. Right. Mm-hmm. You lose them, and an enemy, the degree to which someone is an enemy or is opposed to you in some way is exacerbated, mm-hmm. tremendously. Mm-hmm. And so I agree. And there's too many examples to note, but I mean, like the stuff that gets on social media and the level of censorship, and, Gina Carano was in an incident a couple of days ago in Hollywood where she said, like, it's literally insane. And that's why, I said at the beginning, like, I feel like I'm in a crazy world because all I see is this crazy behavior all around. And
I'm glad that I'm not the only one that feels that way. I'm like, I sit there and I literally said, I was like, am I going insane? Like, what is wrong? Like, am I the only one that sees this? Like, it's a huge problem. And like, yeah, that Gina.
What were you going to say? Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, and we talk a lot about like government bad in Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. Like government's just people, no different than you and I. Like, and they play to a different set of incentives. And, so I don't think government is bad. I just think their incentives are too divergent from the incentives of the individual. Mm-hmm. And what we need to do is realign incentives. And I think Bitcoin as a meta incentive that forces everyone to play by the same rules helps to foster that alignment of incentives. And I think as a result, you'll see less divergence between individuals and the systems of governance that we erect to coordinate our behavior, across larger groups of people. Mm-hmm. Because like we'll always have some form of governance. I think a lot of governance can be embedded in the money. And I don't mean in the sense of like we program smart contracts in Bitcoin. I just mean if the money is good enough, it really it removes the necessity for a lot of governance. And like the structures of governance that we have are by and large there ultimately because of the type of money that we have and the systems that are required to administer, protect, make up for deficiencies and that kind of stuff. But I'm not against people in government. I just think our incentives are too divergent. And I think to the extent, I kind of think peace, prosperity, cooperation equals the imbalance of power minus the aligned incentives. So mm-hmm. the more so imbalance of power is just kind of how reality works. Whether we're talking about planets, individuals, countries, whatever, like the one with the greater amount of power will be able to, if they choose, express that to their own benefit, right? Mm-hmm. That just seems to be kind of a law of reality, a law of nature. But if you align incentives, that diminishes the effect, or kind of it removes the need to express the imbalance of power, right? Because you're both, you both have the mm-hmm. same goal. You're both running in the same direction. And so I think to the extent that we can align incentives, and again, I think Bitcoin is massive in that regard, that will that will remove the imperative or the influence of imbalances of power that will always exist in different ways. And that will mean we'll have more cooperation, more prosperity, more peace. And I think 99.9% of us want that. Mm-hmm. And so it's not me versus the government. I know that's easy framing right now. And a lot of us really dislike a lot of the things that the government is getting on with, and they've gone down a really bad road. But it's just people in governance. And what we're seeing now, and this is a very hopeful thing, is that some people in government, even though they're starting to be impacted by the incentives of Bitcoin, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. And so they are starting to make the case for Bitcoin. They are starting to promote Bitcoin. Cynthia Lummis in Wyoming, you've got Mayor Suarez down in Miami, and so people are starting to pop up, and they're saying this is the principles of Bitcoin are the same as the principles of the founding of the United States, which I think were founded on phenomenal principles, right? Mm-hmm. Like we mentioned, one was free speech and, individual sovereignty, and, those are great principles. It's just that when they're written in a document and the political structure is said, like, let's base our the way we operate on this, you're still back in that trust domain. It's like, well, there's nothing really forcing you to continue to operate in that way. It's just like a nice to have. It's a nice rule that we can choose to abide by or not. With Bitcoin, at least insofar as the network is concerned, you can't violate the rules of the network. And I think the fact that it has that, and it expresses these ideas or represents these ideas of freedom, I think is very appealing to people in the government and in the population that also value those ideas of individual freedom and sovereignty, because there are still many, even in the government. And I think because the way the U.S. was founded, it may be, even though it's like the most powerful government in the world, and presumably they have the most to lose by Bitcoin ascending to dominant global money, I think the ideas and philosophies and ideologies on which it's founded make more of a magnetic pull, between the two to come together. And I think it forces people in the government, if they really truly believe in those principles on which the country was founded, that they have to ultimately accept it and adopt it and promote it, because it's on very similar principles. And so, I think it puts your principles to the test in many ways. And this is why we see a lot of changes that happen on the individual level, but especially if you're in a position of governance in a country like the US, do you really believe in individual sovereignty and freedom? Because if you do, you shouldn't be against this thing. And so, and the more that becomes clear, I think the more political pressure will be on those people to explain themselves if they don't, right? If they don't agree with it or whatever, and there's a lot of hurdles to cross, and there's a lot of FUD, and there's going to be the environmental FUD, and there's going to be, all the regular stuff. But there's a wave of information, and there's a wave of intelligent and articulate people coming to represent this and willing to ride or die for it, basically. And I'm in that category. And so that's encouraging. And so, as perhaps this is always the case in history, you've got like annihilation on the one hand and peace, prosperity, and like possibility on the other. And you're walking on the razor's edge in periods of history. And, maybe one wins for a time, one loses for a time. Hopefully we're on,
I always count on the goodness of people, like the goodness of the average person. Like you said, even in government, like it's, government bad, but like there are generally people are good. You know what I mean? Like people don't generally want other people to be worse off. It is interesting, like you said, of the U.S. adopting it. I think, it's kind of like Steve Jobs, with innovating in Silicon Valley and how you have to cannibalize yourself to stay on top. I kind of think that that's what the U.S. has to do to stay on top. They have to eat the dollar. They have to, adopt Bitcoin, and maybe they'll do it. Maybe they won't. Just a couple more questions, but with you're mentioning like different governments and the FUD and everything. Like for new people, they might go on the internet and see like China has 50% of the hashing power and they can shut down Bitcoin. Like outside of of course you can dismiss it, but like are there real threats to Bitcoin for people that don't know it well enough? Like what could shut it down? I always tell people the only way it could be shut down is if the entire Earth got EMP'd. But if that happens, we have a much bigger problem than our money system going away. But other than that, I don't have a good way to explain to people that it can't be shut down.
Yeah, I don't, like you said, like anything that could shut Bitcoin down permanently pretty much shuts humanity down permanently. Like an asteroid or nuclear bomb or something like that. Like, because we rely so heavily on our information systems today. And if those go away, and the gold bugs, like that's always a case against Bitcoin or for gold. It's like, yeah, but if things get really bad, we're going to like be using gold coins again to get our bread. I'm like, if things get that bad, where information systems are completely shut down, you're not going to want gold. You're going to want lead and water. And by lead, I mean bullets, because that's where things are going to be. And so I don't think anything can shut it down. Depending on what jurisdiction you're in, the people that govern you can make it more difficult for you. Like Nigeria just outlawed it. India seems in the next 3 to 6 months, they're going to outlaw Bitcoin or outlaw cryptocurrency. And that's really stupid for them, because if you understand this system, you understand that it's not stoppable. And when you have something that's unstoppable and that provides value to people, the inevitable outcome is it wins. And if you are betting against that, if you are banning your people and your country from Bitcoin, that's just a really short-sighted decision, and that's going to hurt you and your people in the future. So that's really, really stupid. But as far as it, like if the tax treatment in different jurisdictions, China, when I was living there, they shut down the exchanges. Right. So it's not illegal to hold Bitcoin, but you're not allowed to exchange it. So stuff like that can make it harder. But again, it doesn't stop Bitcoin. It just unfortunately makes it more difficult for certain subsections of the global population to get access to it. I hope that doesn't happen in the States. States, obviously, there's been a lot of innovation and adoption of Bitcoin. It's probably the country that's adopted Bitcoin the most. And then you've got places like, the Netherlands and Japan and Germany that are high up there as well. But I don't think you could turn off all of China's hash power, and they, the system would readjust, and hash power is coming online all over the world on a regular basis. It's becoming more decentralized through, this waste gas mining and finding sequestered energy to put Bitcoin mines on and mine Bitcoin from there, which decentralizes the hash power. And it's early days for that. I mean, the biggest argument that comes up is like government could somehow marshal a majority of the hash power and censor transactions basically for in perpetuity, which theoretically possible. I think, first of all, the government would dramatically show their hands that like we are authoritarian and against freedom and we're going to stop this thing. And even if they did, I think the collective will of the global of humanity would figure out ways to push back, compete, and ultimately outcompete those government efforts, right? And for all the power they have, governments are exceedingly inefficient and clumsy and slow and stupid in the sense of you can never have a centralized entity have as much quote unquote wisdom as an emergent market process. And so colluding centralized governments of the world versus billions and billions of people conjuring up market solutions, I'm putting my bets on the latter. So I don't think a shutdown is realistic. The only thing that I think, it's happening now. So the only thing that is a consideration is the jurisdictional arbitrage, right? So if you are a person in Nigeria or India, and you have a substantial portion of your savings in Bitcoin, maybe it's time to move, right? And that may be the case in Canada. That may be, probably is going to be the case in Canada because, all the things that the government are doing now, they're going to need to tax the living shit out of this population over the next 10 years, if not sooner. Mm-hmm. And that's going to put a lot of, that's going to be seen as a egregious infringement to a lot of people. And they'll be coming after all of your assets, and there'll probably be a wealth tax. There'll probably be an unrealized capital gains tax and all this sorts of craziness. And so people will have to maybe move around in order to not be subject to the policies in their jurisdiction. That's to be expected, but that does not shut Bitcoin down at all. It just means, for a period of time, you might have to be a little bit more agile if you want to take full advantage of the network.
Yeah. And I mean, I had somebody say, well, what if China gets more than 50% of the hash power and then they decide they have all the voting rights and they shut it down? And I was like, to be honest with you, I don't know it well. I was like, I don't know the ins and outs of Bitcoin well enough to answer that. But is that a realistic threat, or is that?
No, I mean, if they have 51% of the hash power, they can censor transactions. They can. It's not like they can steal. I mean, they can go back a certain amount in the blockchain, but not very far, and not an extent that would kill Bitcoin or anything like that. And and the ultimately, and this is kind of like a Hail Mary or nuclear scenario, but the UTXO set, the ledger, is still everywhere. There's a copy. You can never destroy that, and that's kind of what's that allows you to restart if ever something like that happened. But I think the most likely scenario, if there's someone gets the most hash power, is they attempt to censor transactions. I just think the market routes around that, in a not very long period of time. So it just ends up being a huge waste of money for the attacker. Now, now obviously, the thing is if you have 51% of the hash power, you're not losing money necessarily because you're gaining money. But if you attack the network,
destroying the value.
Right. It's possible you screw up the economics of that, and then then the attack does maybe end up costing a lot of money. Or it's a valid question, but from my understanding, it's just that it's not something that can be executed for a long period of time. There will be a large cost. It will be very difficult to do it without being noticed. And I think the market will route around it. Mm-hmm. So, it's definitely not something that keeps me up at night. And look, we've always kind of talked about this stuff in Bitcoin and thought about it in a very adversarial way. And I think that's good. And I think it's possible, maybe even probable, that things come down the pike in the future that are adversarial. But right now, there's a lot of tailwinds. Governments, most governments aren't signaling that they're going to try to stop this thing. Most governments seem to be signaling that, they're fine to let it integrate into the system and let all the big play, because the other thing is governments are run by people, as we said before, and those people are usually either powerful people or influenced by powerful people. And the most powerful institutions in the world are banks. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin pulls on, the one thing that kind of does align everybody is greed. Mm-hmm. And so all these banks see this $1 trillion asset, very close to it now, and they think there's a lot of money to be made here. I want to make some. I want some of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that their greed is going to cause them to let it in the front door. It doesn't even have to barge down the gates or sneak in the back door. I think they're going to let it right in the front door. And, and maybe they rationally understand that when you game this out, if you're an adversary, you say, okay, can we stop this thing? If yes, how and how much does that cost? I think a lot of people that have to ask that question, the answer is no, it can't be stopped. Okay, what's the most rational approach then? Well, the most rational approach is to align with it, stake our territory, try to benefit and maximize our opportunity with it as much as possible. And so I think that's what we're going to see is like, we're going to see a lot of people that confront it and say, holy shit, this is happening and it can't be stopped. How do we not get destroyed by it? How do we take advantage of it? So Bank of New York Mellon yesterday, who custodies over $2 trillion in assets, they said, we're going to deal in Bitcoin. We're going to offer it to our clients. We're going to issue it, whatever the hell that means. But, they're going to be involved in the ecosystem, because at $1 trillion valuation and what a lot of people expect to be a $10 trillion and then $100 trillion valuation, you're going to be left out in the cold if you don't get involved. And the process of getting involved just makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy and perpetuates the momentum that's already been generated, and ultimately disintermediates and disrupts a lot of the existing business models of these places. And I think they realize that. So what to bring that to the most relevant domain is, everyone's always asking, like, when will central banks start putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet? And then, if you got like Venezuela and Iran and North Korea, who apparently already do. I'm not sure the validity of that information. You can't really trust those jurisdictions, but let's just say that's true. I think a lot of them probably already are, because they're not stupid. And I'll use China as the example. My experience and observations of the Chinese government, having lived there, is that they're extremely pragmatic, and they're more than happy to do one thing with this hand and do a totally different thing with another, and not tell anybody about it. And I think they look at this thing and they say, this could be massively disruptive to fiat currencies and, to the way things work now. It could also be a massive opportunity. In any case, it would be really irresponsible of us to not have a position should this work out in the future. And, maybe we'll never find out, or maybe we'll find out in 10 or 20 years. But if I was to bet, and if it could be verified somehow, I would bet money that they've been accumulating for a while. For the very same reason that Bank of New York Mellon or any other private company would do it, is because you look at the landscape and you say, if we don't, we're going to be at a severe disadvantage. If as a business, as a corporate entity, as a bank, as a government, if we don't put Bitcoin on the balance sheet, if we don't get involved in this business, we're going to be put at a severe disadvantage in the future by making that decision. And therefore, we're not going to make that decision. We're going to get involved. And I think that those are the dominoes that are falling now. And people are starting to realize that.
Yeah. That's what I'm starting to feel as well. I feel like everybody's going to get in on it. Whoever jumps first is going to be the first, is going to be the most beneficial. And that's why I think the US has to adopt MicroStrategy.
Yeah, well, sure, on a nation state level, but like, the fact that MicroStrategy was able to pick up, let's say, 71,000 Bitcoins, like, that's going to be when kids are studying business in the universities of the future, that's going to be the case study of like, bow down everybody to how prescient and how much of a boss move that was, because that's going to be a lot of money in the future. And it's going to be, and the way he went about it and the way he was the first, and of course, the way he's articulated his reasoning in podcasts and media since, it's going to be a fun case study for some future business student or economic student in the future.
Oh yeah. Even with my like different businesses, I'm like, probably the best way to 10x our revenue is to just put our entire like balance in Bitcoin. like really, like I could do nothing. So I mean, let's improve revenues. Let's grow the businesses. But like the most likely scenario, or the highest probability of 10xing our revenue would be to change our treasury over to Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, well, put it this way. MicroStrategy, I think they were around since 89, but maybe went public in 98 or something like that. But let's just use the public date. So over the course of 20 years of operating their business, they accumulated $500 million in savings on their balance sheet. 20 years of work. And in the last 4 months, they've turned that 500 million into over 2 billion, so that extra 150 or 1.5 billion is equivalent to 60 years of operating the business. 60 years net income from operating the business.
That's crazy.
That's pretty, I mean, like, so back to that point about if you don't make that decision, it's not even just like salivating about the upside. It's, can you remain competitive against people that do make that decision? You know, like whoever, I don't know who MicroStrategy's competitors are, but let's say they've been competing for the last 20 years. Can you still compete with MicroStrategy if they just put 60 years of net income on their balance sheet that they can do shit with to fuck your shit up?
No,
probably not.
Nope.
You know, if you were neck and neck before and now they have that advantage, probably not. So that's going to play out on every scale. It's, you know, like if people don't make that decision, they're probably going to be outcompeted
pretty quickly
in the not too distant future. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be exciting to see. And one last thing, a lot of people, especially if they've made it to this point in the podcast, they're new and they're thinking about getting into it, but they probably are looking at Bitcoin going, wow, $48,000 of Bitcoin. I can't afford that. And, even when they figure out the fractal, you can get 1/millionth or 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, but what's that going to do? What is your message to people to let them know that it's not too late? Like they didn't miss the boat. It's still early to get in.
Well, first, everybody thinks they're too late. And I mean people that got in when Bitcoin was $1, right? Mm-hmm. You can go back on Twitter and see the tweets or go into the forums and see the threads of people talking about how they missed the boat when Bitcoin was $1. And the same thing when it was 100, and the same thing when it was 1,000, and it'll be the same thing at 100,000. It'll be the same thing at 1,000,000. Like to the extent there's still people that are out. So, the nominal value is kind of meaningless. Like, look, as it gets bigger, the ability for it to get bigger diminishes, right? Because like when it's $1, it can 1 trillion X, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we're not going to see a 1 trillion X from here, but we're probably going to see 1,000x from here in our lifetimes, for Bitcoin. So, and also like, this is my typical answer is even when it's got 100 trillion, 200, 300, whatever trillion market cap, like when it's dominant global money, like it's what the entire global financial system runs on. It's still a buy because it's money. Like, it's not like at that time I'll be like, whoa, it's too expensive, I'm not going to buy anymore. What else am I going to use for money? Right. So again, it's a kind of a perspective of how you look at it. And what we discussed right at the beginning, don't think of it as an investment, because then you're thinking about timing, volatility, gains, all this stuff. Think of it as money. This is how you preserve the value of your capital. This is how you preserve the sacrifices you made in the past. This is how you maintain your optionality on the future, right? So through that lens, the price is irrelevant. Is it the best way to do all those things? Is it the best way to do all of that? If the answer is yes, then you just siphon your savings into that. And like, I get it, it's only 12 years old and there's still question marks around that. So I'm not saying all of your savings right now. I'm just saying, like, even when it's $10 million a coin, I'm still going to be buying it because it's how I want to preserve my savings, preserve the value of my savings and my optionality in the world. So it's like everyone likes to get rich, basically, right? And that's kind of the problem with like altcoins and distractions. Is like people think there's more upside to them, but you got to understand we're not talking about the same thing. Altcoins is pure gambling. It's like maybe someone else will, maybe people will pump it so you can make more money, but when are you going to get out? How much is enough? Like all these questions. What we're dealing with Bitcoin is the next iteration in the ever evolving process of human beings trying to upgrade the form of money that they use. Bitcoin is the next iteration in money. And that's a huge, huge deal. And it doesn't matter what price you get in at. Are you going to be looking at your amount of Bitcoin and deriving a US dollar exchange value for it? Because that's kind of the wrong way to look at it. Everyone likes to know how rich they are, but like I said before, just the fact that your nominal value of Bitcoin is increasing, that means your savings are increasing. And that's what you should be looking at. Forget entirely the exchange rate. I know it's exciting. We on Twitter, like we get all bombastic when it hits new all-time highs, but that's irrelevant. You know, like you start off with 0.001 Bitcoin, and then a month later or a year later, whatever, you're at 0.002 and 0.01 and 0.02 and 0.5 and 0.9 and then 1. Like that's how you should be looking at it, because that's all that matters. That means that more of your work is being stored in the most effective way for the longest period of time into the future. That's what matters. So don't try to time the market. Don't do any of that shit. Take an amount that you're comfortable with and start considering it as a savings vehicle for your future and your kids' future and your grandkids' future and generations into the future. That's the way to look at it. So Bitcoin is always a buy in my opinion, because every time I buy it, the nominal amount of Bitcoin I have increases. I don't actually care about the exchange rate.
Yeah, that's, I think I learned that lesson. I tried trading one time to like increase the value of the dollars. And I found myself, as soon as I did it, I wasn't looking at the dollar. I was looking at how many Bitcoin I was going to get back. You know, like, because I did do it, and the price went down. And I'm not recommending this to anybody, because I did it once, and I felt like it was literally for like 2 hours. I sat there like watching the price, and I like was in turmoil. I felt terrible. I'm like, why did I do that? Why did I do that? But it went down. And that was the aha moment for me, was I saw that the amount of Bitcoin I was going to own when I bought back in went up. And I was like, whoa, I'm not looking at the dollars. I'm looking at the Bitcoin. And then ever since then, I'm like, the best way to guarantee that you get more Bitcoin is to just buy it and keep buying. So
exactly. And that is a shift for a lot of people. And like I said, it's different to how they look at every other investment they've ever made. So the framing, I think that's beneficial, is that this is money. It's not investment. That's how you should look at it.
Yeah. You don't own more stock in General Electric. You own more currency. That's more important.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And a lot of new Bitcoiners, I think, will appreciate it, and they will inevitably, they'll find you. And if they found this, they found you already. But, this Rapid Fire podcast, I strongly recommend. It's a great listen. John, I really appreciate your, like very calm demeanor on your podcast. It's refreshing, because like this can be such a volatile world. So it is nice to have that, kind of calm and steady presence. And so anybody, check him out there, and on Twitter as well. And thanks again for coming on.
Well, man, I appreciate the invite and the kind words, and congratulations on getting this thing off the ground, and I look forward to seeing more.
And that was John Vallis. Great interview with John. I really appreciated his time, and a lot of the stuff we talked about, especially getting into the sovereign individual and what it means, and the power that comes with being in charge of your own money, and how that kind of breathes into the power of other parts of your life and having control over that and power. So I really appreciate John coming on. Check back for more episodes next week, and let me know any feedback. Always welcome. You can find me at Bitcoin Simply on Twitter. Thanks, guys.